Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 88 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a ramshackle room in a cottage in the Norfolk countryside. The furniture is old and cheap, and there are few amenities. There is no running water, electricity, or gas, despite that it is 1958. Jenny Beals is by the sink, washing up, when her husband, Jimmy, a garage mechanic, wheels his bike in from work. Supper is ready on the stove, and Jenny's younger sister, Beatty, calls from offstage. She has come from London for a visit home, and will shortly also bring her fiancé, Ronnie, from the city to introduce to her family. She is bursting with new ideas and ambitions that she has acquired from her life in the city and from her intellectual boyfriend. Ideas that will bring her into conflict with her provincial family. This is Arnold Wesker's play, Roots, a story of doomed love, rural poverty and socialist protest, and most of all, of cultural aspiration and growing up and away from family, from one's roots. Roots was first presented at the Belgrade Theatre, Coventry in May 1959, with Joan Plowright as Beatty, before transferring to the Royal Court in London and then to the West End. It is the second play in what is known as the Wesker Trilogy, a sequence of plays drawn from the author's own life and socialist political concerns that were part of a movement in theatrical form and subject that came to be labeled kitchen sink drama. As we record this episode, a new production of Roots is playing at the Almeida Theatre in London, in repertory with another play written by the so-called angry young men, John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, which in repertory scheduling of our own, we also covered in our most recent episode. The Almeida show stars Morfydd Clark in an effervescent and very moving performance as the coming-of-age Beatty. The production is directed by Diyan Zora, and I'm delighted to say that Diyan joins me today to tell us about Wesker's classic play. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Diyan. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm going to do a proper introduction. Diyan was the 2021 recipient of the Genesis Future Directors Award, which is a collaboration between the Genesis Foundation and the Young Vic Theatre that over the past 20 years has developed the careers of some of the UK's most dynamic directors. Diyan's directing credits include the Pulitzer Prize-winning play English at the RSC and Kiln Theatre, Mum, How Did You Meet the Beatles in Chichester, Tom Fool at the Orange Tree Theatre, Lysistrata at the Lyric Hammersmith, and Clippies at the Young Vic. Diyan is also a playwright and was a member of the Bush Theatre's 2022 Emerging Writers Group. Okay, so Diyan, when did you first come across this play, Roots, and what drew you to direct it?
I actually watched it in 2013 at the Donmar. I loved it. And as you do, I forgot about it afterwards. And then a few years later, when I'd started directing, I was just looking at a bookshelf of plays, trying to find new plays to pitch around. And there was just such an overwhelming number of plays that I thought I'll just go to the very end of the alphabet. So I'll look between, T and Z to start there, because my surname is Zora. So I thought I'll stay in that region, just to see what comes out.
Alphabetical by author, then. Wesker would be near the end.
Exactly. And I saw Wesker and I thought, that's really familiar, that name. And I couldn't remember why. I pulled it out. It was a collection of his plays. And one of the first plays in the book was Roots. And I'd forgotten that I'd watched it, and I read it. And I think along the way I remembered that I'd watched it. And then at the end, I was in the Waterstones near RADA in Bloomsbury. I just cried. And it was very embarrassing because I was standing, in a public place surrounded by people. I was just so moved.
I love that.
Yeah. And I just thought, gosh, if it can have this effect on me, then maybe it can have this effect on other people too.
So I assume you discovered a little bit more about who Arnold Wesker is. Could you tell us a bit about him and where this play comes from in his life and his work?
Yeah, so Arnold Wesker is a playwright who emerged in the late 50s and 60s. And he was from a Jewish background, a working class background. He grew up in London. in a very politically active family, almost exactly as it's described in Roots, actually. So I think he grew up with a mother who was like had a very strong political consciousness. He grew up surrounded by socialism, big political ideas. He was there on the streets with his family fighting fascism, in the late 40s. And he wanted to be an actor, and I think he got into RADA, but he couldn't afford the fees, so didn't go. And thought about starting to write. And the thing that really propelled him to write actually was watching Look Back in Anger.
Ah.
That really propelled him, which I think is such a wonderful thing about the Rep. So he was propelled to write, and he wrote Roots. And he sent Roots to, I think it was to George Devine.
At the Royal Court.
Yeah, but he said, the play's great, we love it, but you need to write another act where Ronnie comes. A spoiler alert, by the way. So his first note on it was, we'll only program it if you do this. And he refused. He just flat out refused. Joan Plowright had read it and said that she'd play it anywhere. And the Belgrade and Coventry decided to pick it up as it was. And it went so well in Coventry that it then went to London, and the rest is history.
In fact, I think Roots was the second play in what became the Wesker trilogy. So the first was Chicken Soup with Barley, which also was picked up and was done at the Royal Court. And so he submitted, as you described, a second play to them, thinking that they'll be interested, of course, and we're keen to do another play with him. And I did a little bit of research on Wesker because I didn't know that much about him either. And as you say, he was part of a politically active family. In fact, he was a politically active socialist all his life. And he went on the original Aldermaston March in 1958, protesting against nuclear weapons. And in 1961, Wesker himself was actually arrested as part of one of the demonstrations and spent, I think, a brief time in jail. And as we'll come to, there are some nods to socialist and anti-nuclear stances in Roots. But I also was going to ask you about other autobiographical elements in the play. Most significantly, the character of Beatty, who's based on his wife, Dusty, who also came from a Norfolk farming family. So tell me a bit about that background.
So it's not just Beatty. The entire family is based on... So I've met Dusty, who's Arnold's wife.
Still alive, obviously.
She is. She's coming actually this week to see the play on Saturday. So we're very excited.
Great.
Yeah. So Dusty also has a brother and two sisters, like Beatty does. Mrs. Bryant is very loosely based on Dusty's mother. The relationship between her mother and her father is quite accurately represented in the play. So the autobiographical nature of it, or the truth of it, goes beyond just Beatty's character. And what Arnold did was he went to stay in their family home in Norfolk, and he just listened to them and he just typed. And I think you really feel that when you watch it. There's a kind of hyper reality to it in the way they speak. He's really good at capturing their everyday rhythms, not just in the things that they do, but in the ways that they speak and in their dialect. And actually, Wesker, interestingly, said that he didn't think the play had to be performed as if it was set in Norfolk. He was very happy for a Welsh company to take it on and do it in Welsh accents, for example. For me, it felt really important that just wherever we set it, it wasn't in London. It needed to feel separate to the place that's considered the main place. And Norfolk felt like exactly the right choice because it was the original place, but also Norfolk has such an otherworldly quality about it.
Yes.
Just so far away, and the accent's so different to every other accent. And it just gives it a kind of mythical quality to me, a kind of fable-like quality, which I really loved.
Yeah, well, it's definitely important that it's set in the countryside. And as you say, very specifically Norfolk, because in the text that I've got, there are notes at the beginning that he gives about the pronunciation of the vernacular language. And it's an important part of the play, I think, the language. There's this kind of lyricism to it, the repeating of vernacular vocabulary and phrases. And it's in some ways amusing to listen to, but it's also very lyrical. And it's also part of the cultural theme of the play, I think, which we'll come to, about communication. But going back to the autobiographical nature of it, you're absolutely right that it's the whole family and himself. So I think the character of Ronnie, who is Beatty's boyfriend, who lives in the city and is Jewish, he is basically based on himself to some degree. But most dramatically, I think, is the figure of Beatty based on his wife, Dusty. And their meeting and their story is fascinating because it's part of what we see in Roots. You talked about him failing to get into RADA because he couldn't afford it. And he ended up working as a kitchen porter in a hotel in Norwich where he met Dusty. And as you say, he started writing the play while he was staying at Dusty's parents, literally sitting in the very room, essentially, the play is set in. And he talks also about Dusty, and there are things he says about Dusty, which I think apply to Beatty as well, about her effervescent personality and that she was from a farm laborer's family. And as he said, she had no middle-class expectations. And when he went to meet the family, they thought he was from some completely other world. But he also said when his family met Dusty, he said they responded to her vibrancy, but were bewildered at their relationship, at the cultural gap, which, of course, is fundamental to the play as well. And there was an interview that they both did in 1994 in The Independent, where she also talks about their first meeting and how he was so dynamic and she was hungry for new experience. And there's a great line where she said, "I'd never heard classical music before I met Arnold. Every Sunday afternoon, I lay on his bed and we'd make love to classical concerts on the radio." So I couldn't resist that one. And that's Beatty as well, I would say. But you mentioned Dusty. Have you had any communication with her about doing the play? And if so, what would she say about seeing herself virtually on the stage?
I've had a lot of communication with her. And actually, just to point out that Ronald is an anagram for Arnold. So Ronnie is so directly related.
Oh, brilliant.
I know, I love that kind of thing too. And so when I first got the job, the first thing I did was ask the Almeida to put me in touch with Dusty. And I went to visit her in Hove and she made me lunch and we talked. And she showed me all the photos of the family because I hadn't realised how much the play was based on her and her family. When I'd read it, I thought it took inspiration, but I hadn't realised how directly and immediately. Although what's interesting, I think, is that my experience is that when plays are based on people, even very directly in this case, when people watch themselves represented, they don't see themselves because we don't know ourselves in that way. So it will always feel like a stranger unless you literally name the person after the person.
But surely Dusty knows and sees herself from what she was just saying, describing herself and Arnold. Surely she would see that.
She does, but also she sees a character and a creation. She'll say things like, well, it's not me, because you have your own perception of yourself. And then you have the way others perceive you. And it's sometimes very difficult to marry those things. So I saw lots of Beatty in Dusty. So, for example, I saw a kind of modesty, which I think is very associated with Beatty. So I think Beatty, in the first act, for example, her sister says, "So you're an artist then?" And she takes a big pause and then she goes, "Yes?" ? And when I was with Dusty, I said, "Well, can I see some of your paintings?" Because this was true that she had painted. And she was like, "Oh, no, they're terrible. They're terrible. You mustn't look at, And so she still reminds me of Beatty in lots of ways when I met her. And also, when I was with her, I said to her, "Well, how do you think you've changed between then and now?" In the sense that the play is almost like a snapshot of what you were like then. How do you feel you're different now? And she said so many interesting things about how you change and grow as you get older. And I think one of the things she said, the one thing that hasn't changed about me is I'm just so stubborn. I'm so quick to judge people. And I thought that's exactly what Beatty says in the play. So stubborn. That's exactly how Ronnie describes her. So it was very fun because it's almost like when you paint someone, that's what I think of this play as.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yes.
Yeah, Wesker has painted her. And I think the play is a love letter to her. I think it's a very generous play. And I think he wrote it to uplift her and honour her world and her people.
That's also true, yes. And I mean, she is a wonderful character. She may have been modest, but she's also effervescent and warm and full of energy and life. So this is a great introduction. Can we give listeners who don't know the play a brief synopsis of what actually happens, who these characters are, and what the main plot of the play is?
Sure. So Beatty Bryant is a 22-year-old girl from Norfolk. She's grown up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, really, in really rural Norfolk. She's moved to London because she's met a boy called Ronnie, who's an intellectual and very progressive, has very wide-ranging cultural interests, and he's just blown the top of her world. And she's been with him for a couple of years and needs to introduce him to her family. So the very beginning of the play is her coming home 2 weeks before Ronnie is due to come. And she's come this time to get prepared for Ronnie to come. So this is a big deal, introducing him to her family. In the first act, she stays with her sister, Jenny Beals, who she's very close to, and her husband, Jimmy Beals. And that's the first time we see a hint of a cultural clash. So Jenny and Jimmy live quite a slow life, I'd say, and they're very content in that life, but they're certainly not at the forefront of the big city and all the cultural things that emerge in that.
No, they're not rich either. He works, as I said, as a garage mechanic, and they just about get by.
That's right. And in the second act, we meet Beatty's mother, where the core of the culture clash really sits, I guess. And in the second act, we get to know the rest of the family and see this relationship unfold between Beatty and her mother, which is very complicated and very real, I think. And then in the third act, we build to the entire family gathering for the event of Ronnie arriving. We meet the brother, we meet his wife, and there's all sorts of moments in that act that tell us about what life was like in the 1950s, about people getting TVs for the first time, about the threat of nuclear war, about the kinds of things that people were worried and concerned about. And Beatty in the middle of it all, just very nervous that Ronnie's about to arrive. And then here's the thing, he doesn't show up. In fact, a letter arrives, and it's a letter from Ronnie breaking up with her, because he's had 2 weeks apart from her. He's had time to think about it and realise they probably aren't right for each other. The problem is the whole family has gotten together and a lot of money has been spent and a lot of food has been prepared, and it's devastating and it's shameful and it's embarrassing and it's humiliating, and Ronnie's done a really, really terrible thing and Beatty's broken.
They're all dressed up. It's heartbreaking.
Yes.
Some part of us, I'm bound to say, can see this coming.
Yes. Yes.
But it doesn't make it any less devastating.
No.
One of the interesting facts is that they have been together, I think there was a note, for 3 years.
Yes.
And they've never met him.
Yes.
Which I think tells us something as well. And she's very nervous about, as you say, I think she's worried about being ashamed of her rural family because this intellectual metropolitan character coming from the big city. So, it's set up for a potential car crash of a meeting in any case. I'd like to ask you about the form of the play, Diyan. I mentioned kitchen sink drama in the intro, which I think describes plays that are set in very ordinary naturalistic settings. And of course, much of this play is actually set in the kitchens with actual sinks. And it's also about the portrayal of ordinary domestic life. And for a large portion of the play, not a lot happens. I don't know whether that's fair to say. They are going about the usual routines of a day in a rural farmhouse and community. But that is also the point, isn't it?
100%. So this term kitchen sink drama, Wesker himself, at least at one point in his life, seemed to reject that term. He actually thought of Roots rather than a kitchen sink drama as a lyrical journey of self-discovery, which really informed how I staged it, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, stripping away whether there's actually a kitchen sink on stage or not, in terms of the form and what the focus of each act is, it's on the everyday, ordinary rhythms of life, but those are constructed in such a way that creates something that feels very poetic and very compelling. So you're not just watching people do absolutely nothing and it's very boring. You're watching people live, and the rhythms of how those moments are put together, it's very subtle and it's very delicate, but at its best, it's super compelling. And it's because there is a lot going on underneath. And when there's not something going on, it's filled with an action, or, an onion is fried or a plate is washed up or whatever. So when you read Roots, there's almost as many stage directions as there are moments of dialogue. And it's a very special and unique way of writing. It's almost, to me, as though Arnold Wesker wanted you to feel what he felt as he heard those pots clattering on the table and the water running and the smells. That's what he wanted to immerse you in.
He paints a really authentic picture, I think, doesn't he, as you say, painting earlier. And one of the most compelling features is the slow pace of it, of the rural domestic life. He's not afraid to allow these domestic tasks to be enacted in almost real time. And there's a wonderful sense of the repeating rhythms of their lives within the household and the community. They cook, they clear up. Beatty even fills and takes a bath on stage.
Yes.
And you talked about the smell of things. Wesker described how they actually fried liver and onions on stage in the original production, which the front rows apparently gasped at the smell of, which one can imagine. But about the pace of things, Mrs. Bryant, the mother, is repeatedly remarking on what goes by on the road outside, for example. It's a running sort of joke, but it also sets the feeling of the pace of life, because she notices the regular timing of the local bus or the fish van or somebody's lorry going by on the way to market. And so it's this quiet existence where what passes intermittently past the window is an event for her. And that's by contrast to the imagined busy, chaotic life that Beatty will have been living in London, of course. So that's setting up that contrast. And I loved in your production, the stage was revolving very slowly, evoking the slow passage of time and the slow rhythms of their lives here. And you talked about how it builds, or he structures it. He did say that he was eager to capture the slow pace of pause and silence described in Norfolk rural life. And he'd called it a collection of moments juxtaposed in a way I thought added up to a poetic impact. I wondered, though, whether it's a theatrical challenge or even a risk as well that the pace is so slow. I noticed that some of the reviewers had trouble with this, but I think it's important to embrace it, is it not? Because it's central to the theme of this contrast between the cultures as well.
Totally. And actually, Wesker always thought the play could run at 100 minutes, and we're running it at about 100 minutes. So we're sort of in line with what Wesker had originally intended. That wasn't intentional. I just directed it how it felt right. And if it had been longer than what Wesker had intended or shorter, that would have been fine. But yes, you have to commit to it. And also, I find something slow in the theatre when it lacks detail, even if people are talking really fast. So I don't think people are compelled by how fast or slow something is. I don't think that's what pace is. I think pace is playing the energy of the place and time and the character. And once you nail that, then people are compelled because they're immersed into the world. And I think we've done really well in that regard. I'm really proud of the way we've paced Roots, because I think for a modern audience, we were always walking a tightrope of, it can be so slow that it can be alienating, but it can also be so fast that an audience don't feel the world or the way this world operates. And then if you don't feel that, the play doesn't make sense.
Yes, absolutely. That's so important, the rhythms of that life. And in fact, he said, in a stage direction, he says the silences are important. Throughout the play, there is no sign of intense living from any of the characters. Beatty's bursts are the exception, which is important too, because she's coming into this quiet world, bursting with her enthusiasms and aspirations. And it is also a slow burn, but it builds, doesn't it? The tension of the anticipation before Ronnie's arrival or non-arrival and that cataclysmic result. I mean, it's sort of earned that by the slow burn towards it, knowing that these are the stakes. So I think it works beautifully in that regard. Let's talk about the characters, Beatty primarily, and we talked about her in relation to Dusty, what a wonderful character she is, effervescent and charming and warm, but also infuriating at times, self-centered, pretentious even.
Yeah.
She's pretty mixed up. She's at that stage of life where she isn't fully formed, searching for her identity and her future, which is part of her being young and full of life. But she lights up the play every time she's on the stage, doesn't she?
Yeah, totally. She's a great part for a young actress because she's so three-dimensional, and that's the joy. And Beatty is a challenging part. Thankfully, Morpeth Clark, who played the part, is amazing.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, it was hard work, though. You know, if Morpeth was here with me, I'm sure she'd agree. You can't just come in and it comes. Like, you have to constantly be thinking and working and molding that part, because it's very easy for her to either come across as just one thing or one note.
No, she's complicated
Yes.
because she's torn between two worlds and she's growing as we watch her, leaving behind something she was, trying to find something different, but still partly what she was. And she's both, as I said, charming, but also can be very irritating.
Yes.
She has the flaws of her youth as well. And I thought the play captures, and her performance captures perfectly, these contradictory feelings we have when we return home, when we revert to being a child and we relish the familiar comfort. She's warm and loves parts of the routines that go on in her sister's home and her mother's home, while bristling as well at the unchanging confines of it, at family members who we love and who drive us crazy within minutes, right?
Totally. And that switch between love and combat is really central to Roots. And it can be quite sudden, that switch. But that's what life is like. I often find when I'm sitting with a group of actors in a rehearsal room, and I say, well, I don't understand why my character just suddenly switches to that. And it's like, well, that's what it's like in real life. I mean, you do switch at a moment. And I completely agree. There's something about home, which is like a hotbed for extreme emotions. And I think most people would find that to be the case. And I certainly feel it when I go to my family home. You know, I can be my grumpiest and my loveliest in the space of 45 minutes. And I think it's something about being around people who know you in such an innate way that the mask drops, you know, the mask that everyone sort of wears at work and in grown up society. Well, the people who've changed your nappies know what you are beyond that mask. There's no hiding it, is there? So you're home and you're just all you are in both the worst and the best possible sense. And so it's always fun doing plays set in a family home. They're some of my favorites as a director.
It's interesting you're saying about how quickly you can switch between love and combat. But actually, what's going on as well is it's partly prompted or fueled because there is this kind of underlying agenda based on this cultural difference and BT's journey in her life that predisposes her to be examining herself and where she comes from and her mother's behavior. And it just sparks her. She's trying to evaluate why she is as she is and what she can be and what's holding her back. And of course, she blames her mother for not encouraging her to learn more about the world, to expose her to culture, that her mother has lacked curiosity or ambition herself and therefore for her children. She talks about, no wonder I don't know anything about anything because you've always turned me off classics. I never read any good books because there are no books in the house. I mean, that's pretty formative, isn't it? But also, at times, she can feel pretty cruel and certainly patronizing to her mother, blaming her for all of this, when in fact that doesn't feel entirely fair all the time, does it?
Totally. And it was one of the things that really frightened me when I was going into working on the play. I remember really worrying about it before we started. There's always this terrible 2 weeks before you begin rehearsals as a director where you're not with everyone yet. So you're just alone with your thoughts about the play. And the thing I was afraid of with this was that BT and the whole project of Roots would come across as condescending or patronising to the working classes, held in this relationship between BT and her mother. And then as soon as I started working with the actors, I felt fine because it became clear that Morpheus had the capacity to hold all that text in a way that was both true to how harsh she has to be on the mother to make the scenes work, but also make it feel real, that it comes from a place that's recognizable. I think the thing is, we all have the capacity to say things to our families that we regret or that we wouldn't say 20 years later or that aren't quite fair. And that's part of youth. I guess the greater political thing that's going on in the play about pop culture, for example, that was hard to navigate because I think we live in a time now where the left in particular, or the progressive point of view in society, is actually quite in favour of pop culture. I'd say that the feeling in the 50s is different to the feeling now about that. So I don't think a modern progressive audience can connect as well with the idea that BT's mother listens to bad music and therefore she's not open-minded enough or something. Whereas in the 50s, I think that idea would have resonated much more closely with the young left who are watching.
I think you're right. There's a broader definition of where cultural value lies.
Exactly.
The traditional view in the play in that sense is that her mother, Beatty's mother, listens to sentimental, popular romantic music and has no idea about what classical music is. And to be properly culturally educated, you need to know classical music. And this extends across all the arts. She's talking about exposure to art and culture in that traditional way. But I think in the balance of what we think about Beatty and how she behaves, one of the things that informs her behavior for most of the first part of the play, at least, is that she's also just parroting views that she's picked up from her boyfriend. And she starts virtually every sentence by, Ronnie says this, which makes it even more infuriating when she's being patronizing to her mother.
Yes.
But it's also interesting to watch her evolution. You mentioned before about her painting and that moment where we discover that she has started to paint and, in fact, has sent 2 paintings home to show the family. And again, without being condescending, this is a bit of a surprise, isn't it? And certainly it means very little to the family. And when, as you say, her sister says to her, you're an artist then, I thought the stage direction was wonderful because it says, such a thought had not occurred to Beatty before. It pleases, even thrills her. So she does take a moment where she enjoys and realizes that there's some progress being made and she is evolving. But of course, this is a complete contrast to her family who don't really appreciate it in the same way, do they?
No.
It was based on Dusty, who was a painter as well. And I read Wesker wrote a letter to Dusty when he was in Norfolk with her family, and he had brought her paintings to show them. And he said they didn't quite know what to say. They knew they liked them, but only for the colors. And when he asked her mother if she could live with a couple of them in the room, and she just said, well, they'd make no difference to me. They wouldn't really register in her world. But also there's another great symbol of Beatty's cultural education in the scene that closes Act 2 when she puts on a record, and we talked about classical music, of Bizet's L'Arlésienne Suite, it's called, I think.
Yes.
To try or show her mother what classical music can be. And she dances with complete joy, swept up in the music. It's a fantastic scene, isn't it?
Yeah, it's my favorite.
Is it? Why?
Well, that and the moment at the end, because it feels like if Roots is a piece of music, those 2 scenes at the poetic crescendo, we're using the music metaphor, they're just moments where the whole orchestra starts playing. Roots is defined by a restraint.
Yeah.
And then those 2 moments lack restraint. And because you've seen so much restraint until then, they move you because there's a sudden release. And I feel the audience moved, and I'm moved every time. And the music is so beautiful. Yes, it's L'Arlésienne, which is a not often performed Bizet opera. We originally had Carmen when I started working on it. But as time went along, it felt important that the music wasn't too recognisable.
Yeah, that's too obvious.
Yeah, it was too obvious. My sound designer was like, no, it has to be L'Arlésienne. And L'Arlésienne actually as an opera, I think, is the story of someone returning back to a village that they haven't been in for a long time. So it was a very prescient choice on Wesker's part.
Ah. As you say, it's an explosive scene because we talked earlier about the pace and the quietness. It's just fantastic. And it's important thematically as well, of course, because it's a vivid enactment of how art can move you. She is actually overwhelmed by it. She is responding to it in a way that, albeit Ronnie has counseled her, he said to it, listen to it, let it happen to you. And it is happening to her. But not only that, she's actually learned how to appreciate it because she identifies, as she tells her mother, the 2 tunes in the composition that are knit together. So she's got some understanding of how it's made. And as we said about the pacing, he wrote that the long, delicate curve stretching from a very, very slow beginning across 3 scenes to the end of Act 2 and the exultant Bizet dance. So what you're saying earlier, it's deliberate, the way he's structured the pace of this thing. And of course, it's highly representative of what's going on in Beatty's journey. She's breaking out, expressing the new her she could become in this moment, I think. Because it is very much, I think you've said in your program notes, a journey of self-discovery that she's on, isn't it?
Totally. And one of my favourite lines in the play is when she says, listen to me, if you let it happen to you, you'll become as big as the music itself. So for me, there's something about self-discovery or becoming who you are being in tandem with how big and beautiful this music is. And that's why we repeat the music at the end.
Ah, yes.
Because at the end, she becomes the music through those final lines. she becomes as big as the music itself. And just to hark back to something you were saying before about the Ronnie quotes, the Ronnie quotes really troubled us in rehearsals. We found them very difficult to do.
Why?
I think it's because it's always difficult as a character to imitate another character, just because practically you're like, well, how good is this character at acting someone else? That's your starting point. And then who is this person? You have to give the actor a very clear idea of who they are. And I won't say who Morpeth chose, but she chose someone very specifically in her brain to imitate because she needed a picture of him. So just technically, they're very difficult to achieve. But also, they're a very odd device. It's very odd to watch a play where someone is imitating someone.
Yeah. And it very specifically says in the stage direction that she imitates him, right?
Exactly. But then when we first started playing it in front of an audience, they sort of became my favourite parts in a way because the audience really jumped on board with them, I think. And I think that you earn the end because she's quoted him so much. So those final lines are so moving because she's been parroting someone else for so long. And also the act of parroting someone else rescues the play a little bit from the feeling of, oh God, she's just being really mean to her family. Because actually, she hasn't got enough agency to be mean. She's almost in a whirlwind, just spinning around, not really knowing what they think about things. And so Ronnie's voice becomes a comfort blanket because at least she knows what to say. And that's the point at the end. She doesn't need that comfort blanket.
Yes, that's right.
And thus she can speak. And we've all had comfort blankets. We've all, men, women, old, young, everybody has had moments where they can't figure out what to say. They need someone else's voice to help them through. And that moment where you find that you can speak is incredibly liberating. So we can all connect with that. And I think that's why it moves people.
That's funny you say that. I mean, this is a slight tangent, but actually it just occurred to me that actors often do that, speak in other people's voices because they're very good at doing it.
Yes. Yes.
We need to talk about Ronnie because she's aping him, but not entirely comfortably. She even confesses that she doesn't really understand half the things that he's saying. There is this sense of a Svengali kind of influence going on, isn't there? And I wondered what you made of the picture of the relationship. It's a slightly uneasy one in some ways, isn't it?
Yes. So I come from a Middle Eastern family. I was born in Iraq. I've lived in the UK since I was 3 months old. And the play really reminds me of how, in the more conservative part of my wider world, there was something about the way Beatty spoke, which really reminded me of that. And it was how women in oppressive and patriarchal societies exert power. So when you're in a space where you don't have, so Frank Beals tells a story in Act 3 that Jimmy has supposedly told him in the pub about what to do when you want to have sex as a man and you want to find a woman who wants to have sex as a woman. How do you communicate that? And he did this speech about how to find out who wants sex. And I think it's a really interesting snapshot into those early questions about consent, because this was a space and time where, so Jenny has an illegitimate baby. That's a big deal in this society. And so I think a lot of the way Beatty talks about Ronnie is reflective of the time, the space, and the culture. How women had power in those circumstances was by figuring out ways to catch them. She talks about the fact that because she slept with him, he felt a responsibility to her, and that's what kept him in her life. And to our Western modern point of view, that seems quite shocking. But it was very true of that time, and it's very true of many societies and cultures now.
You're right. She says that he wasn't necessarily that interested initially, and she gave herself to him.
Yes.
And they've been living together, unmarried, in London for several years. So that's clearly part of her power, that she played that card. But also, what about the control element? I mean, maybe a step too far to say that there's something uncomfortable about this young woman being dominated and manipulated by this man to a degree that she may not even consciously recognize. Is that overreading it?
No, I think it is uncomfortable. And I think we had the conversation very openly in rehearsals. I think that it's about being really nuanced about it. And it's about going back to Wesker's intention. So I think Wesker has written a play that is very critical of himself. So Ronnie does not come out well in this play.
That's true.
The audience don't sit there and go, God, he's a great guy. He's really annoying, and he comes across as elitist, snobby. And the second thing is, not only does Ronnie come across as not very likable, the family are written in such a loving way. And you're really on their side, I think. They're written with great pity and dignity. And as a result of that, even though Beatty, I think, is in a very controlling relationship with Ronnie and it feels very awkward and uncomfortable, the balance of the play and the way it's presented to the audience doesn't favour Ronnie. He doesn't even get a chance to show up and put his point of view across. Right?
No, it's extraordinary how clear a picture we get of this person we never see.
Exactly.
But you're right, and he comes across as patronizing and controlling, pretentious. There's a supposedly huge cultural gap, and we discover that he actually failed all his exams, works in a kitchen, and is self-taught. So he might have the kind of zeal and possibly even the insecurity of a self-taught man. And we also have that sense, don't we, that this is not destined to survive, possibly. I mean, we talked about how we may have a sense that he's not going to turn up, because what is that relationship based on? We've already said that she has given more than he has. I mean, she said he never said he loves me. And Jenny recognizes that they are really different. She says, well, you don't seem to have anything in common.
Yes.
How is this going to survive?
Well, that's the thing, because all these characters in the play that you really like tell you the truth about Ronnie. That's the thing. And that's very deliberate on Wesker's part. Basically, I think that he wrote this play to uplift his wife and to question his own complex role in her journey. Because I think when you're an artist and you're a playwright, you're a director, or an actor, when you're with someone who's not an artist, often, not all the time, but often, the person who is not the artist spends quite a lot of time emotionally holding the artist. It's a very common dynamic because artists sometimes consume a lot of air with all their thinking and emotion and all that kind of stuff. And I think Dusty, in a way, held on for a lot of his life. And even in the early years of the relationship, he could tell that was the case. And I think in a way, through this play, he was questioning and throwing it up into the air because he knew, and to this day, Dusty adores Arnold. So I remember speaking to Morfydd about the final line, God in heaven, Ronnie, it does work. I can feel it's happened. It's happening to me. I'm beginning on my own 2 feet. I'm beginning. I wanted to cut the word Ronnie because I felt that it would be so frustrating to watch an entire play where she's parroting someone else. She finally gets her own line at the end about how she feels about things, and she's got to say God in heaven, Ronnie. Like, why does his name have to appear at the very end as well? But actually, Morfydd pushed back against that, and I'm glad she did, and we kept it. Because although it's uncomfortable, and it is uncomfortable to watch someone so under the spell of someone else, the writing is intelligent enough and nuanced enough to signal to the audience very early on that this person probably can't be trusted.
But as you say, he's deeply influential, and she's acknowledging that, I guess, right? And it's interesting to say about Wesker's being so frank about himself, because there was a nugget I discovered which plays to this perfectly. The germ of Ronnie's betrayal may also have come from his own relationship with Dusty early on, because he wrote once that he sent her a letter saying their relationship should end, and she ignored it.
Yeah, I know. I love that story. I know.
Yeah. And he also said to her about his play, it's a triumph for her, not him.
Yes, yes. And I agree with that assessment. I don't think Ronnie comes across well. But I think two things can be true at the same time. Ronnie can have greatly influenced Beatty and controlled a lot of her life course. And also, the very best thing that could have happened to her was that he wasn't in her life anymore. But it's natural. It's a natural part of growing up that you meet people who influence you massively. And part of growing up is working out what influence to hold on to and what influence to let go of. And she goes on exactly the same journey with her parents, right? So with her mother has been a massive influence on her and who she is. And at the end, she has to work out which part she's going to keep and which part she's going to let go of, really, because that's part of growing up.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As we go, we imitate people we admire. I mean, it's part of how we work out who we are and build our own identity. It strikes me when you're saying that she's better off, and I think we celebrate her freedom in the end. We've painted this picture of her emerging out from underneath Ronnie, prompted, as it turns out, ironically, because he dumps her.
Yes.
But her response is defiance, ultimately, asserting her independence, which is part of the point of the play and its payoff. But it also touches on the place of women in this society. I mean, as you said before, she has to maneuver to whatever advantage she can. And to some degree, they're all in this position, the women, aren't they?
100%. And I think, to me, it's a play about women. The women have by far the most lines. They have really interesting arcs. I mean, Jenny Beals is a really fascinating character, and Mrs. Bryant is such a great part for an actress. I think Wesker has written these women in a very sensitive, very three-dimensional, very exciting way, and I think they're a joy to play.
Well, he's also championing, as you just said, the men hardly say anything. And part of the point of the play we touched on earlier is he's championing communication and language, right? The women talk. Beatty says her mother doesn't talk enough, and she talks tons, but Jenny does. They are the talkers, and they see things and they say things. The men seem to be not recognizing any of the truth at all most of the time. But it's a tough world for them. They're economically powerless, essentially, most of them.
Yes, I mean, and also a really weird thing about Roots is that all the men are in pain.
Physical pain.
Physically in pain. I still to this day can't fully explain it. I have a number of theories as to why he's done that. Some of it is I think about a political comment on how capitalism destroys working bodies. Another part of it, I think, is a comment on how a sort of overindulgence trying to feed an empty space can leave one with guts ache, right? So BT says you guys just all eat all the time. That's all you do. You just eat. And actually, I think that's a comment on how when we feel a sense of emptiness, we can fill it with all the wrong things, and that can break us in a way, which is very true of today.
They're also having a hard life. Their work is physically demanding. And, Mr. Bryant, the father, is broken basically by it. And there's a whole subplot of that and how that's affecting his potential to be employed at all because the farm manager sees that he's not keeping up and puts him on half hours and half pay. And I wanted to take that maybe as a question about the politics. In the play, we started talking about Wesker as a political activist. And there are some political issues touched on this play, but how significant are they? This isn't actually primarily a political play, is it? Or do you think it is?
I think it is, but I think that the politics it's almost like Wesker's taken with his hands, he's just grabbed these big political ideas and like squeezed them into everyday interactions. It's taken the macro and squeezed it into the micro. So it's there, like informs every interaction. So like people's money and financial status informs every single act in this play. And apathy is the big thing, I think. And it's interesting, I was watching the show the other day and she was speaking in Act 3 about our collective apathy as a society and how we're just not really confronting things that are going on. And you could just feel in the audience a sort of collective nodding. So I think some of the politics really resonate in a very direct way today. Some of them don't, obviously. Some of them feel much more specific to the 1950s in that moment. And that's always part of doing a play of that era. But yes, I think it's a profoundly political play, but I think like all the best plays, that politics is concealed for most of it and sort of emerges in this massive speech at the end. And I think Wesker not only was a profoundly political playwright, he was very personally active, and that was because of his upbringing, right? So if you're 5 or 6 years old and hearing your family debate politics around the dinner table, you're going to carry that into your day-to-day life.
Yes, and so they do, you're right, in personal terms, they touch on issues that affect them. So, we talked about the insecurity of the agricultural workers, of her father, that his hours can just be cut because he seems physically incapable. And they talk about how every time there's a pay rise for agricultural workers, the owners dismiss people. So there's little protection or job security in that world. Ronnie goes to political meetings. Beatty says he's a socialist. And we see Beatty aroused by these issues, like the treatment of her father. So she's becoming aware. And as you say, apathy is an important element. She criticizes her mother for cultural apathy, and she aligns that with political apathy as well. Generally, you have to be engaged in the world, and you have to look beyond the limits of your day-to-day world in order to do so. I read somewhere that Wesker was beginning to be worried about the loss of political faith in the progress of socialism in the time. And he talked about presenting political faith in all its innocence, when the world was young and all things possible. And there's this sense that BT may represent that. She's still young. She's at the beginning of this political journey for her, whatever it may be. She's up for the fight. She sees the injustices and wants to call them out. There was also, I read in one of the introductions to one of the texts of the play, that it was suggested that there's a sense of disconnection of the majority of people from control of their own society. So these agrarian workers in Norfolk have zero control over their economic futures. I think there would be a lot of people who would say that this is familiar, feeling disenfranchised in some way today.
Totally. And it resonates with me personally. So I remember in 2003 standing at a march of 1 million people against the Iraq War. And then the Iraq War happened anyway. And I often say to people that was such a turning point for me because I was very young. And it's the moment I went from this feeling of political optimism, like I could make change, to feeling this dreadful sense that change wasn't possible. And I think a lot of people feel it. Whatever political standpoint you are, I think there's a real sense now of that we can't affect change or we can't move things forward. And there's so many existential threats at the moment that feel really overwhelming. And it's so much easier to just watch Strictly Come Dancing or...
So BT would be criticizing you here, wouldn't she? I mean, this is her point.
Oh, she'd be on my case. Yes.
Yes. This is her point that she attacks her mother for, and this apathy about not being engaged. And I wanted to ask you what the meaning of the title of the play connotes for you. What does this title signify?
I think for me, the thing I've always been drawn to in the play is this profound personal question of when you have to let go of where you started in order to create your future.
Yeah.
And you have to take a bit of that, but you have to let go of a bit of that. And so I've always thought of it as a very personal route. Like it reminds me of a hazy picture of the place where you were formed, the place that you emerged from, and how you reconstruct yourself through life in order to survive and grow and flourish. And for me, the thing about roots that I find very moving and very personal is that question of how you relate to your family as you grow older. So that's what roots means to me. But roots in the play, I think, speaks to something deeper and wider than that. I think it speaks to our sense of purpose and why we're on this earth. What is the reason we're here? What are we capable of? What can we achieve? What can we do? And I think it's, if I may add, it's really interesting to me, Wesker's heritage, being Jewish. I think his extended family were from Eastern Europe. But I think there's something about, and I've read this in his diaries and his autobiography, that he talks a lot about his Jewish heritage and how that strong sense of family and connection was like a magnet that drew him in, right? But then on the other hand, there's a sense that he has to make his own life and he has to build his own world and get together with someone like Dusty who doesn't really mirror his family. So I think that he's really interested in that question of where you come from and where you end up and what the journey is between the two places.
I think you're spot on. It seems to me that it has two contexts. The first being personal, as you say, that we are the inevitable product of our origins, our personal roots, and we're simultaneously capable of transcending them, but we can never leave them behind. So it's how do you forge that identity? And BD says when Frankie asks her, she accuses everyone of having no roots. And Frankie asks her what she means. And she says, roots, the things you come from. So we've talked about things. And also she says, the things that feed you, the things that make you proud of yourself, roots. So it's also about what sustains you and how you grow. That's your own roots that keep you alive and growing. And then there's the more macro context that you touched on, where she also talks about sort of roots in the sense of the history of mankind overall, and that we are not in touch with that somehow in order to learn from the past and seek to improve the world generally. Let's talk about the ending of the play. We have talked about what it builds to, and as you rightly said, the way the pace of this works, as we get towards the end, it all comes out, really, doesn't it? You know, after Ronnie doesn't turn up and has dumped her, we have her own cry of pain and self-blame as well. She actually realizes that she has some responsibility in what's gone on between them, which is also a step forward, of course. Her mother finally has a go at her too. And that was also refreshing in some ways. I mean, we have most of the play where Beatty is criticizing her and she just sort of takes it and says, I don't understand you, and carries on and all the rest. Finally, she just loses it and says, I'm sick of this. You blaming me for everything. You're old enough now. You've been living on your own for this time. It's time you took your own responsibility. And by the way, my life's no picnic. And it's great when she finally comes out with that. But I wanted to ask you where we get to. She makes this grand speech. And it doesn't really matter what the speech is about, is what I was going to say, because, she talks about popular culture and anesthetizing the masses and all that. It isn't really about that subject itself. It's the fact that she's making this speech herself, and it's her own words, as you've alluded to, that are not Ronnie's, which is why she says, I'm beginning on my own 2 feet. I'm beginning. So the play ends with a note of hope, does it?
For me, yes.
You believe in her future? Is she going to prosper?
Yes, because I think she's just not going to quote like she did before. I think it's the joy of the imagined world where Arnold was offering a version of Dusty's future where she could fly. Now, whether Dusty flew or not, I don't know. I mean, that's a totally separate question, but that was the offer for Beatty, I think, that Beatty miraculously rises above something in that final moment. And everything in the play that happens leads her to that moment. So every interaction with her family, from the beginning of the play, it's like a train leaves a station and that train will eventually reach heaven or something. And I think it's a truly transcendent and hopeful moment. The only complicating factor for me, there are complicating factors, of course, but the most obvious complicating factor for me, which I put into the staging as clearly as I could, was that the family gathered around the table was separate to her now. And that was very important to me because I was very interested in the question of how self-actualization and self-realization, just to circle back to the Middle Eastern thing, because I think it informs my point of view on this. I'm always very interested in the idea that in the West, we have all our individual rights. We have the right to be who we want to be, to date who we want to date, to live where we want to live, to study what we want to say what we want to say. It's amazing. But I also find it quite lonely. I think that one of the key differences for me between England and when I'm in Iraq or when I'm in other countries in the Middle East is a sense of profound sense of loneliness, of separation. In the Middle East and in lots of Eastern cultures and traditions, there are far fewer individual rights. But old people tend not to die alone. They tend to live with the family, and the community still exists, and there's structures that hold people so that they don't die alone. And I'm very interested in this tension between the rights of the individual and the importance of having some sense of community and togetherness. And I think there's something about Beatty at the end standing separate and alone, which is both very powerful, but also quite sad because she is separate to them. They will sit together and they will eat together and they will celebrate together. And I don't know where she's going to go next in a way. I don't know if she's going to be alone or not. I don't know.
That's a fabulous point. And actually, it's spot on in terms of, I think, the interpretation of the text, because I was going to say, and I've just got it in my hand here to remind me that when she's making this great speech in self-revelation, the stage direction is the murmur of the family sitting down to eat grows as Beatty's last cry is heard. Whatever she will do, they will continue to live as before, as Beatty stands alone, articulate at last. So yes, she is separate, and they're carrying on, almost oblivious to that. And of course, this is the problem. Once she's left and found a different world and a different her, you can't completely go back. It's interesting when you talk about language earlier, that one of the metaphors Ronnie comes up with, the importance of communication. He talked about words as bridges, which would bring people together. So whether she can bridge that gap, and we're celebrating her as an individual, that she's found her voice. But to be cut off from your community is, as you say, that is lonely. You mentioned at the very beginning the fact that when he sent the play to the Royal Court, the artistic directors there suggested that he add a third act in which Ronnie appears, saying that everyone would be very keyed up to finally see him. And I think, oh my God, how madly can you miss the point?
Yes.
Yeah, the point of her is her evolution and emancipation, and of that tension between where she comes from and where she's going. Great. Diyan, This play was written more than 60 years ago. And, in some ways, the portrait of this backward, impoverished rural life feels almost historical now. So is this a dated period piece? Why is it still relevant and worth reviving?
For me, no. I think that the fact of Wesker going to sit in that family home and listening to them speak and typing, it's proved to me that the more specific you are, the more universal a thing becomes. And by that same logic, the more timeless. I think people of all ages can associate with what they see in Roots, but particularly anyone who's left home and come back can associate with that feeling. I think it resonates just as much as it ever did.
You're right. We empathize because we feel the truth of these characters' situation and their suffering. And there are still divides, one would say, between provincial and metropolitan societies, I would hazard to suggest. And the tensions between generations within a family are universal and timeless, with the young seeking to fly the nest, sometimes by kicking at its walls, as Beatty does. And we obviously believe that plays can be of their time and remain there and still be relevant over time. And you've done a lovely job with it. And I didn't know the play, and it was great to discover it. So thank you. Now, before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover on the podcast or that's just a personal favorite. So have you a personal favorite you could volunteer for our listeners?
Yes, The Wild Duck.
Ah, great. We haven't done The Wild Duck yet. We've done some Ibsen, but we haven't done The Wild Duck, and I'd love to do that. Why do you love it?
It's another good family drama. It's all about secrets and lies, The Wild Duck, and it's all about the masks that we put up. And it's a play that's profoundly personal, but it's got these huge political questions in it. And I think of all Ibsen, it's got an ending that's devastatingly unforgettable.
Well, he's pretty good at devastating endings.
He's pretty good, but I think, for me, The Wild Duck is the best one and the hardest one. And I think both personally and politically, it's just such a complete play. So yes, I recommend that one.
Well, I would hope you get a chance to direct it and we can come back and talk about The Wild Duck sometime.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Diyan. So, as the curtain falls on Beatty's cry of freedom, what do we make of her somewhat self-centered, searching aspiration? It must be an inspiration to believe in one's potential to grow, to achieve what we might have thought impossible from where we come from, to nurture our own new roots, but at the same time not to judge or condemn others and the scope of their lives or their cultural knowledge or tastes, choices that are inescapably informed by our roots. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.